Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. When through the woods and forests great I wander, and hear the birds sing sweetly in the trees. When I look down from lofty mountain grandeur, I hear the brook and feel the gentle breeze. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. And when I think that God has Son not sparing, I scarce can take it in, that on the cross my burden gladly bearing, He bled and died to take away my sin. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. When Christ shall come in shadow acclamation and take me home, what joy shall fill my heart. Then I shall bow in humble adoration and there proclaim how Lord. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Savior God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Good evening. Have a few announcements that we need to make. Our men's prayer group meets Tuesday evenings at 6. Our mission emphasis for the month of June is India. There is an ongoing basket shower for Zephaniah Wayne. The basket's on the table in the back. Vacation Bible School is coming up very quickly, June 8th through the 12th, Sunday through Thursday night, 6 to 8 p.m. nightly. We do need cookies for that, so please keep that in mind and help us out. Bring a package of cookies and put them in the kitchen, if you don't mind. There is a change with the preparation of food boxes. We normally do that on Sunday evenings, but because of BBS this week, we're going to prepare the food boxes after morning services, so please keep that in mind. This coming Sunday, June 8th, prepare the boxes after morning services. Green Valley Bible Camp, June 15th through the 21st. Safety meeting, June 15th, 5 o'clock p.m. Questions and answers, Sunday night, June 22nd. June 29th is a fifth Sunday. Joe Evans from Indian Missions will be here to speak to us during both class time and the worship time. And of course, all of the contribution on that Sunday will go towards missions, and we will have a singing service that Sunday night. Promotion Sunday is July 6th. Girls Future Teacher Training Camp is July 13th through the list that we need to remember. Luann again is home recovering from both elbow surgery and a procedure for stomach ulcers. Terry Wells has lung cancer and has a surgery coming up June 17th. Glenna Lyon and her family, the sudden loss of George Bonilla. Owen Hill was in the hospital and was sent home on hospice care with heart failure. That is Travis Hill's father. Florence Ramsayer's surgery went well, and they were able to remove a lot of scar tissue and put a cushion under her kneecap. I believe she will do much better. Please continue to remember Sheila Dean. They are home, but she is still in a neck brace and struggling with some heart issues as well, so there's some recovery left in front of Sheila. Continue to pray for both her and Owen. Also want to extend our condolences to the Coleman family in the recent loss of Randy's brother, Bob Coleman. Graveside service will be tomorrow, 4 p.m. at Gracelon Cemetery in Van Buren. And also would like to extend our condolences to the Alma Waters family. Alma's brother, James Jones, recently passed away. So please remember James Jones' family. And Carolyn Cooper is scheduling a hip replacement surgery. So several that we need to continue to remember in prayers. Anything I did not mention that I need to mention? Genesis chapter 1. Then God said, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them. God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over every living creature that moves on the ground. It's very difficult to try to quantify or qualify false teaching. All false doctrine is dangerous. All false doctrine is wrong. It takes us away from God, takes us away from Jesus. But one of the false teachings that's out there that has become more and more prevalent in my lifetime is the idea that man was not created, that we evolved over a long period of time, and we were not created in the image of God. When you read this creation account, it doesn't say anything at all about the plants or the trees or the fish or the birds or the other animals being created in the image of God. It just doesn't say that. It says that man and woman were created in the image of God and blessed by God and given dominion over all of the creation that he made. That's an important doctrine. That's something that we need to be reminded of on occasion. What makes that false doctrine so dangerous when you begin to talk about the fact that there is no difference between man and animals, that there is no separation between man and the rest of creation, we begin to lose sight of our purpose. We begin to lose sight of our focus. It becomes easier for man to remove life from another man. It becomes easier for a man or woman to make a decision to kill an unborn child. It's an easier decision to make when you don't believe there's any difference, when you don't believe there's any separation. If I'm just like the fish that are swimming around out there in the ocean, if I'm just like a tree that's growing there by the side of the road, if I have no purpose, if I have no direction, if I have no significance, then why does it matter? I wanted to remind you tonight that you're not like the fish in the sea or the snakes that are crawling around on the ground. You're not like the bushes or the trees. You're a man, you're a woman, you were created in God's image. You've been blessed by God. We have a special relationship. We were created to have a relationship with him. That's our purpose. That's why we're here, to have a relationship with Him and to share the good news of His Son with the people that we encounter so that they can have a relationship with Him. When we understand that, we become fulfilled. When we're fulfilled, we're meeting our purpose. Our life has meaning. It has direction. Not happy every second of every day, but full of joy, fulfillment. You know why you're here, and you know who you are, and who you belong to, and you know where you're going. It's very important that we don't just let that creation story kind of grow old. Every once in a while we need to be reminded of who we are and whose we are and what image we were created in and the separation that exists between us and the rest of creation and our purpose of life. If you're here tonight and you find yourself outside of Christ, there is no need to be. There is no need to be. It's very simple. Inside Christ, salvation. Outside of Christ, you're lost. You're condemned. God has revealed Himself to us. He has sent His Son, His perfect Son, to be offered as a perfect sacrifice for us to respond to, for us to embrace, and by accepting Jesus as our Lord and Savior, we can have a home in heaven. We can live eternally with God. That's available to us today. So if you find yourself outside of Christ and you know what it is that you need to do, I encourage you to do that. If you find yourself outside of Christ and you've had some questions about that, we have many people here that would love to sit down and open God's Word with you, study with you, read with you, pray with you, and help you see the answers that you need. If you're in Christ and you've walked away, you don't have to stay away. You don't have to stay away. You can restore that relationship. If perhaps you just have some struggles and you want to share those with us, we would love to pray with you and for you. If you have any need at all, I invite you to make it known as together we stand and sing.
to our life in general, and let you lead us in the way we should go. Father, as we about to separate and go to our classes, we pray that you'll be with the teachers and the students in a way and let them hear what they need to hear and let the teachers teach what needs to be taught. We pray that you'll be with Roger tonight as he brings his own lesson and open our ears and our hearts to what he has to say. We ask you forgive us of our sins and guide us in your light. In Christ's name, amen.
Chapter 21. We have been looking over the last several weeks at the missionary journey of the Apostle Paul. We're on the third journey. Last week we talked about the fact that he did not take the time to go to Ephesus, on his way back to Jerusalem, and he had the Ephesian elders meeting at Miletus. We talked about what he talked to them about, and he had a very emotional departure from them. Verse 38, being sorrowful, most of all because the words he had spoken, they could not see his face again, they accompanied him to the ship. We open Acts 21 now, which is actually, this chapter is actually going to be the end of Paul's third missionary journey. Acts 21 says, when he had departed from them and set sail, we came by a straight course to Kos, and the next day to Rhodes, and from there to Terra. Having found that ship crossing to Phoenicia, we went aboard and set sail. I think we talked about last week about the fact there were two different kinds of ships that sailed on the Mediterranean Sea. There were some that stopped at each harbor. Kind of like when I was in West Germany, the Army, they had what they called bullet trains that would go from one big city to another big city, and they didn't stop anywhere in between. And then they had other trains that would stop every 10 miles in every little city. That's kind of what some of these boats were. They'd stop at every little harbor along the way. And then there were other boats that would go from, like they're going to get one here in verse 2 he talked about in Patera, they got one that was going to Phoenicia. So went all the way from Patera, went south of Cyprus and went into Phoenicia. So there were some who went those long journeys and some who went shorter trips. They first got the shorter trip. They went to Kos, they went to Rhodes, and then they went to Patera. And most of these boats in that day and age did not operate on schedule. You couldn't go buy a ticket and say, I'm going to leave Saturday afternoon at 2 o'clock, and I'm going to get such a place at, on Monday, because of the weather, because of unloading and loading boats and all those things that went along with it. They got there when they got there, and they left when they left. And so a lot of times you simply have to go to the harbor and just wait. So we went to Kos, then they went to Rhodes, then they went to Patera, and having found a ship crossing to Phoenicia, we went aboard and set sail. When they had come inside of Cyprus, leaving it on the left, we sailed to Syria and landed at Tyre. And when he talked about leaving it on the left, you had Asia Minor was up here, Cyprus was down here, and there was a little bit of sea between them, but they went down this way, down below Cyprus. And went all the way across, a straight shot down to Phoenicia. They landed at Tyre, which was one of the big see from that part of the world. Having sought out the disciples, we stayed there for 7 days. They found disciples in Tyre. They stayed with them for 7 days. Through the Spirit, they were telling Paul not to go to Jerusalem. When our days there were ended, we departed and went on our journey. They all with wives and children accompanied us until we were outside the city. Then down the beach we prayed and said farewell to one another. And then we went aboard that ship, and they returned home. We had finished the voyage from Tyre, we arrived in Ptolemais. We greeted the brothers and stayed with them for 1 day. The next day we departed and came to Caesarea, and we entered the house of Philip the evangelist, who was one of the 7, and stayed with him. He had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. When did we first come in contact with Philip?
He was one of the appointed deacons.
Can Acts chapter 6, remember they're having a problem with Hebrew widows and Grecian widows not being taken care of evenly, and the apostle told him to select 7 men who would take care of that issue, and one of the 7 men they picked was Philip. He was also the man who in Acts chapter 8 went down to Samaria and taught the gospel, and went from Samaria all the way down to Gaza to teach the Ethiopian, and after the unit left, he went back up to Caesarea. And that's what this talks about. He was in Caesarea. Stayed there for some period of time, some think probably 15 or 20 years. Was working with the Christians there. So he had 4 unmarried daughters who prophesied. Now, when you come across this verse, people who believe that women can preach will grab a hold of this verse. See, Philip had 4 daughters who prophesied. Well, did they or didn't they? Was it unscriptural completely for a woman to teach?
No.
No. Who taught Apollos? Aquila and Priscilla. A woman could not teach in an assembly of the church. She could teach in private. And most of us, like me, who were raised in Christian homes, if mothers couldn't teach, we'd be in a whole lot of trouble. Because that's who I learned most of what I knew about the Bible from, was from my mother. And from Sunday school teachers at church, and from 5th grade down, every one of those Sunday school teachers were women. I'm with you on several occasions. You put me in a classroom with a bunch of 5-year-olds, I'm going to pull my hair out. I'm going to go start crazy. And so women, based on 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians 14, cannot teach in a public assembly where there are men present. That's the only restriction they have. They can teach other women, they can teach in private, they can teach children, they just can't do it in public. Because that's usurping authority that God has not given them. And so these daughters of Philip prophesied, but I think based on what 1 Timothy 2 and 1 Corinthians 14 says, they prophesied in a setting where there were only women. We're not men there. I have no idea. Doesn't say.
Verse 4.
Maybe. I'm thinking, I got to look back and see, but I think verse 4 when we talk about the prophets were telling Paul not to go to Jerusalem. To the Spirit they were telling Paul not to go to Jerusalem, verse 4. It could. The problem that we have, when I say the word prophecy, what do you automatically think of? Foretelling the future. Do you know that's not what the word prophecy means? The definition of prophecy is to speak for another. A prophet was somebody who spoke for God. Now many of them predicted the future, but that was not everything that they did. If you read the book of Isaiah, if you read the book of Jeremiah, much of what Isaiah and Jeremiah talked about were for the Israelites in their day. And And then they also prophesied some things about the future. And so the word prophecy, we use it that way. It become to mean that in English language today. But when the word was used in Scripture, it did not necessarily refer to foretelling the future. When it says they prophesied, you very specifically could say they were inspired teachers. They taught the Word of God. Now, whether they foretold the future or not, I don't know. Because it just doesn't give us that information. Now, it does mention, it says, they stayed for many days. The prophet named Agabus came down from Judea, and coming to us, he took Paul's belt and bound his own feet and hands and said, thus saith the Holy Spirit, this shall the Jews of Jerusalem will bind the man who owns this belt and deliver him in the hand of the Gentiles. So you have a prophet who not only speaks, but gives a visual lesson of exactly what's going to happen to Paul. If you go to Jerusalem, this is what's going to happen to you. They're going to bind your hands, they're going to bind your feet, and they're going to turn you over to the Gentiles. But Christians did not want him to go. We talked about this somewhat last week. I think Paul went wrong because God wanted him there. There's going to be a couple of instances that happen throughout the next couple of chapters that are going to bring that to mind. Paul had the choice. He could go to Jerusalem, he could not go to Jerusalem. He could go to Jerusalem, he could not go to Jerusalem. He chose to go to Jerusalem. And I believe that was a fulfillment of God's will. Now that's my opinion. It may not have been, but I think it was. And so when we heard this, we and the people urged him not to go. Paul answered, what are you doing, weeping and breaking my heart? For I'm not ready only to be in prison, but even to die in Jerusalem for the sake of the Lord Jesus. And since he would not be persuaded, we ceased and said, let the will of the Lord be done. They almost, you could say, begged Paul, don't go, don't go, don't go, don't go. And he said, what are you doing that for? If I go to Jerusalem, I'm ready not only to be bound, but I'm ready to die. There was one commentator who actually compared this to Jesus. When he was leaving to go to Jerusalem, Matthew 16, Matthew 17, he's telling his apostles, if I go to Jerusalem, I'm going to be crucified and die. And there were some of them who tried to talk him into not going. But he said, I'm going because this is God's will for my life. I think Paul is in that same position. This is God's will for him. And so he ends up in Jerusalem. And when they found out they could persuade him, then they changed tactics. Instead of trying to persuade him not to go, they began to pray for him. Verse 15, after these days, we got up and went up to Jerusalem. Some of the disciples from Caesarea went with us, bringing us to the house of Nathan of Cyprus, an early disciple with whom we should lodge. Now this man was originally from Cyprus, but he is now living in Jerusalem. Paul and his companions who were traveling from the city of Midian, from Caesarea, got to Jerusalem and they housed in Nathan's house. You have to remember, there were a few, what you would call inns in that day and age. They were not in great shape. They were not places you really wanted to be. And most people would travel from place to place, if they could, found some person that they knew that they could stay with. And so Paul and his companions stayed in the house of Nathan, with whom we should lodge. Paul is now in Jerusalem. We are officially at the end of his third missionary journey. He intended, I believe, to leave Jerusalem and go back to Antioch. Because that's where the missionary journey started. That's where the first one started and ended. The second one started and ended. I think he intended to go to Antioch, and he was going to leave Antioch and go to Rome. And then go from Rome to Spain. That was his plan. It didn't work out that way. But that was his plan. He had come to Jerusalem. The brothers received us gladly. On the following day, James went in with us to James, and all the elders were present. Now, it is my contention that James was an elder in the church in Jerusalem. It's very interesting that at this point, in many earlier instances, we talked about people going to Jerusalem, they went to the apostles. Now Paul goes to Jerusalem, he doesn't go to the apostles. He goes to the elders. And there are some people that I happen to agree with them who think you're beginning here the process of the leadership of the church changing from apostles to elders. The apostles were universal officers of the church. They had authority and power everywhere they went. But in the local congregation in Jerusalem, the people who are directly responsible for the church in Jerusalem was not the apostles. It was the elders. And when he met with the elders, some have suggested it may have been in James's house. I don't know that for certain. We're not talking about James, the son of Zebedee. He's going to be, he's already dead by this point. He died back in Acts chapter 12. We're talking about James, the Lord's brother, his physical half-brother, who wrote the book of James later on in the New Testament. And so he is one of the elders. In fact, he's referred to in Galatians chapter 1 as being one of the pillars of the church in Jerusalem. And so he's one of the elders. They have a meeting with him. Paul relates to them everything he had done on his third missionary journey, how he had been blessed among the Gentiles and the great work he had done, what he had accomplished. And I believe is at this point that Paul delivers the contribution to the church in Jerusalem. Remember that third missionary journey, as he went from city to city, he's collecting money to take back to the poor saints in Jerusalem. And he brought it to Jerusalem and he gave it to the elders. And I believe that's where this occurred. I don't know that. I can't prove it. That's just what I think. Now, what we're going to be looking at in the next few verses, part of chapter 21 is actually the part of the New Testament, other than the book of Revelation, that I have the most problem with. I'm not quite sure how we're supposed to deal with it. As we go through this, we're going to talk about why. Greeted them, they talked about how great it was, they glorified God, and then they went on to something else. And it seems like the way this happened, this was a preconceived idea the elders had already made up before they met with Paul. You see, brother, how many thousands there are among the Jews, of those who believe. They are all zealous for the law, and they have been told about you that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, telling them not to circumcise their children or walk according to our customs. Paul had been spending most of his time working amongst the Gentiles. Gentiles, he never had to worry about the issue of the old law, because the Gentiles were never given the old law. The old law, the law of Moses, was the Jews. Now he gets back to Jerusalem, and the issue is there are some Jews who become Christians who are still following the customs of the law. In some ways, Paul did that. Why was Paul in such a hurry to get to Jerusalem? He wanted to be there for the Pentecost. What was the Pentecost? It was a Jewish feast. When Paul went to a new city, where was the first place he went? He went to the synagogue. And so there were still some of those Jewish customs that Paul kept. Now there is a difference, and understand this, there is a difference between doing those things as a custom and doing those things because you believe they are still connected to God's law. There's a difference. There is a big difference. And the difference is evidenced in the way Paul treated Timothy and Titus. When Paul got Timothy, remember Timothy had a Jewish mother and a Greek father. When Paul got Timothy, what was one of the first things he did to Timothy? He had him circumcised. Why? He would never be allowed in a Jewish synagogue or in a Jewish setting if he was not circumcised, because his father was a Greek. Now, a couple of years later, Titus comes along. Titus is a Gentile. Titus is not a Jew.
When some of the Jews tried to force Paul to circumcise Titus, what did he say? No. With Timothy, it was a matter of opinion. It didn't matter. With Titus, they tried to make it a matter of law, and he said, I'm not doing that. It was very difficult. I don't think you and I understand a lot of this. It's very difficult in the first century dealing with Jews who had become Christians, who've been living under the law of Moses all of their life. Their nationality and their religion were vitally connected. The fact that I'm an American and the fact that I'm a Christian are not really connected. At least it shouldn't be. The fact that you were a Jew nationally and you were a Jew religiously were vitally connected. So there were a lot of those Jews in the first century who still wanted to keep the customs of the old law. They still wanted to follow the dietary laws. They still wanted to go on Sabbath. They still wanted to keep feast days. And as long as they did not make that an issue of salvation, and as long as they didn't try to force it on anybody else, there was no problem with that. We're about to run into something that may produce an issue. They're all zealous for all that. Did Paul teach Jews to abandon the law? Did Paul teach Jews not to keep the customs of the law and not to circumcise their children? No, he did not. He taught them that the law was not enforced anymore, animal sacrifices were not sufficient for salvation, and they needed to submit to Christ. If they wanted to circumcise their children as a matter of custom, if they wanted to keep other things as a matter of custom, Paul never said a word about that. And so part of what they said about Paul is right. Part of what they said about Paul is wrong. And what should have happened here, James and the other elders should have stood up and said, Paul, we know that's not so, and we're not allowed this to go any further. We're going to go talk to the people who started this room. We're going to tell them they're wrong, and this is the end of it. And that would have been the end of it. But they didn't. They didn't want to solve the problem. They wanted Paul to solve the problem. Verse 23, do therefore what we tell you. They didn't ask Paul what we want to do. They didn't seek any advice. Seemingly, they didn't even ask God. This is what we want you to do. We have 4 men who are under a vow. Take these men and purify yourself along with them and pay their expenses. They may shave their heads. Thus all will know there is nothing in what you have been told about you, but you yourself also live in observance of the law. What vow do you think they're talking about?
Nazarite.
Probably is the Nazarite vow. Now, there are a couple of things connected with the Nazarite vow. You could not eat grapes, moist or dry. You could not cut your hair. And you could not touch a dead body. Nazarite vows are sometimes set aside for certain periods of time. Maybe 7 days, maybe 2 weeks, maybe a month, maybe 2 months. There are 2 very well-known Bible characters who were Nazarites from birth. Samson and John the Baptist. They were Nazarites from birth for their entire life. Now, here's the issue. Pay their expenses. What expenses? When the end of the vow happened, what did they have to do? Well, they decided that the end, if they, maybe they vowed it for 7 days. On the 8th day, what did they have to do? They had to go to the priest and offer a sin offering. That's what the expenses were. Paying for those sin offerings. Now, considering everything that Paul had taught about the inefficiency of animal sacrifices, about the inefficiency of animal blood, and about the need for Christ, why in the world would he agree to pay for animal sacrifices? at the advice of the elders because the elders asked him to. The other thing you have to consider is that when you offered animal sacrifices, where did you go? You went to the temple. And who offered the sacrifices? The priesthood did. Paul is not submitting to the priesthood anymore because he's not a part of the old law. Now, Paul is really one individual talked about the fact of him being between a rock and a hard place. Because the leaders of the church in Jerusalem are saying what people are hearing of you is causing disharmony in the church. Because there are some Christians who are saying Paul's not right. Paul's teaching us to do all these kind of things. And if he said no to that, then there were some people who would accuse him of being causing disunity in the church. If he says yes, he's going to be accused by some people of being inconsistent. He's in a hard spot whichever way he goes. It's very interesting. We'll look about this in a little bit later, that I think God intervened, and it was stopped before it ever got to the point of the animal sacrifice. Didn't have those, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. But the question is, did what Paul do was right? And the answer you get depends on who you ask. I'm about to give you my opinion, and this is my opinion. You can do what you want to with it. I do not believe Paul should have done that. I do not. I believe what he did with those 4 men was wrong because of his connection to animal sacrifices in the priesthood. Now you have to remember, Paul's inspiration did not guarantee this personal life is going to be perfect. Remember in Galatians chapter 2, Paul talked about the fact he had to withstand Peter to the face because Peter did something wrong. It is my opinion, and my opinion only, that Paul did something wrong.
Didn't Paul have a vow himself that he needed to?
Not that I'm aware of. There's a place early in the journey where it talks about him taking a vow, but by this time that would have already been over. Paul was not participating in, talked about him participating in, he did not do that because of keeping a vow. He did that to support those 4 men who were keeping the vow. And it's interesting, we want you to do this so that people will understand that you're not teaching people to ignore the law. But then they said in verse 25, as the Gentiles who have believed, we surrender with our judgment, and this goes back to Acts 15, that they should abstain from what's been sacrificed to idols, from blood, and from what has been strangled, and from immorality, sexual immorality. They applied a different standard to Gentile Christians than they did Jewish Christians. That's not right either. We all have the same standard. We all have the same gospel. We all should be doing the same thing. I'm going to admit I could be totally wrong. There are a lot of scholars who know a lot more about Scripture than I do who will say that Paul did nothing wrong. I disagree with that. I think he did. If nothing else, he left the wrong impression.
I think he compromised himself.
That's my whole point. He taught all these years that you don't obey the law anymore. You don't go by animal sacrifices. You don't do it because it's not part of our gospel. And yet here he goes back to Old Testament sacrifice.
Was it in Hebrews where it was written, if you would cause a weaker brother to stumble? I may be wrong on the book.
1 Corinthians 8, I think it is.
Right. Well, then he wrote.
No, 1 Corinthians 8 or 9.
Then he wrote, if you would cause a brother to stumble, don't do it.
And the probability is, by the time these events occur in Acts 21, he had already written 1 Corinthians.
So he was compromising himself again.
He wrote 1 Corinthians from Ephesus. The first time he went. Wrote 1 and 2 Corinthians. because of the impact and the influence that he had. And I think that's one of the things in this instance that really stands out to me. Because I think his example in front of those other Jews is an issue. Now again, don't go home and say, Roger said the preacher, the Bible says Paul did something wrong. That's not what I said. I said that's my opinion. One of the things we have to keep in mind is Luke wrote this book for a specific reason. And the specific reason in this instance is to tell how Paul ended up in Roman hands. And how all of these things happen here, and exactly, he just kind of goes over it, doesn't talk about it a whole lot. So we're kind of left to our own understanding here about what a lot of things happen. And if you don't agree with me, that certainly is your right. And I have to admit that about 30 years ago, I didn't think this way either. I leaned to the point that if you thought Paul was wrong, you were denying his inspiration, and that's just not true. That's why I said this is a very difficult chapter for me. It's difficult to figure out exactly what happened and why it happened.
See the difficulty that Paul put in with regards to this whole issue of what people were saying that he was teaching. And the true nature of the gospel, setting aside the Mosaic law, was verse 21, verse 4, is that a prophetic message to Paul?
Maybe, I don't know. The message they were giving to Paul there was more about the fact that if he went to Jerusalem, he was going to a prison. I don't think it was connected to this part of it, but that's just my opinion.
Roger, I could be, I'm not sure I can make a connection here, but I keep thinking about now and today. The times I've heard the gospel taught, my personal experience, it never really came up about, like, well, if I decide to obey the gospel, can I still worship the missionary? It never came up. But I suppose when I was studying, I could have been told, had I asked, well, if you do that, then you can't become a Christian. So the point I'm making is, for Paul here, he could have taken a hard view on this and said, you know, I'm not going to have anything to do with you. I'm not going to support you in these, the expenses and all that. And he might have been a lot of souls that weren't saved.
Yeah. I understand the point that you're making, and that was the elders in Jerusalem's issue. They were afraid that they were going to drive some Christians away.
It's hard.
This is a hard circumstance to deal with. This is a hard situation to be in. I had a friend of mine talk about the fact that he went and did some mission work one time in a foreign nation on an island somewhere where they didn't wear clothes. Now, is my first sermon supposed to be on you need to go get dressed? Or is my first sermon going to be on Christ? What do you do? I mean, situations that we face, I think sometimes we focus too much on the wrong things. I mentioned before, I was raised in a congregation amongst a group of people who really thought it was a horrible sin to celebrate Christmas as Christ's birthday. Now, I don't. I never have. I don't think it's in the Bible. Christ was probably born in May or June, not December. And December 25th was picked because of its connection to a pagan holiday that they wanted to bring into the Catholic Church. That's how we ended up with December the 25th. But when you're talking to somebody who's not a Christian, is that what you want to focus on? Is that what, or you want to talk to them about salvation? You want to talk to them about the blood of Christ? You want to talk to them how to become a Christian? And then once they're converted, we can discuss some of those things. We can talk about some of those things. But we have a tendency sometimes to focus on the wrong things. Heard about a man who was from some tribe in Africa. He had become a Christian. He come to the United States and was converted, and he went back to Africa to do a mission trip. And because he was from this little village, they let him speak. He spoke in his native tongue because that's what they spoke. He spoke for about an hour and a half, and one of the guys who was there on the mission trip who was speaking in English went to the translator and said, "What did he just talk about?" He talked for an hour and a half about the evils of smoking. These people have never heard of God. They don't know anything about Christ. They don't know anything about salvation. They don't know anything about the blood of Christ. They don't know anything about heaven. And I'm going to talk for an hour and a half about the fact that you shouldn't smoke a cigarette. You just wasted an hour and a half. We need to make sure we focus on and emphasize the things that are important.
Any idea of where the other apostles were at this time?
I'm assuming that most of them were probably not in Jerusalem.
Were they being already thrown in jail and persecuted by the Jews?
No, I think they'd all left Jerusalem on mission trips. After some time in Jerusalem, after the church was established and had elders, the apostles started going in other places. Go back to Acts chapter 9, Peter left Jerusalem and went to Joppa. He then went to Caesarea for Cornelius. Historical records tells us he spent some time in Babylon, some time in Rome. So the 12 apostles, none except for James, who was executed in Rome, none of the 12 apostles died in Jerusalem. They all died somewhere else. So it seems that many of them had left Jerusalem doing teaching and preaching somewhere else by the time this came along. Now, when the church was first established, when the gospel was first preached, the apostles needed to be there because this is an infant church with baby Christians. And they really needed the elders to be there. But as they grew and matured, and as they appointed elders, they've got people there who can handle those issues. And so the apostles began being more involved in what the responsibility that Christ gave them. Matthew 28, go preach the gospel to all nations. That's my opinion. Might not amount to much, but it's my opinion. I just heard the bell ring. So, but verse 26 says, Paul took the men the next day. He purified himself along with them and went into the temple, giving notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled and for the offering presented for each one of them. So he went into the temple. Now, we talked about the New Testament uses the word temple in two different senses. Number one, you're talking about the temple complex, which included the courtyard, which included the courtyard of the women, which included the courtyard of the Gentiles. And then you're talking about the temple proper, which is where the holy place and the most holy place was. This instance where it talks about Paul taking those men and going into the temple, he went into the temple. He went into the holy place. But when it says he gave notice when the days of purification would be fulfilled, who do you think he gave notice to? The priest. This is when God's purification is going to be fulfilled, and this is when we're going to offer sacrifices, and it says, and the offering presented for each one of them. So evidently at this point, even though the 7 days of purification weren't done yet, they'd already presented the animals for the sacrifice that was to take place at the end of those 7 days. Question or comment? If you're as confused as I am, that's okay. What you really have to get, and this is the final point I make, even though these issues we talk about, how this ends up has nothing to do with mine and your salvation. It has nothing to do with my relationship with God, because I'm not in the position they were in. Next week is Vacation Bible School. We will not be having Wednesday night Bible class. 2 weeks from the 9th, we will start with verse 27. You want to have a question before we dismiss? I'm done.